Hi, hello, and welcome to Beneath the Ficus with Chris Gordon. I'm Chris Gordon. This is my ficus. This is the first episode. I've brought it inside with me, so hopefully things will work out. This is episode number 4, and today I want to talk about the novel Dracula, Victorian era horror novel written by Bram Stoker in 1897. And it's a classic novel. It spawned all sorts of Hollywood films, TV shows, and the classic image of a vampire is sexy and dangerous at the same time. Although in the book, it doesn't really come across that way. And in fact, the only film I've ever seen that really captures the novel is the Keanu Reeves 1992 version of Dracula with Anthony Hopkins. And the first time I saw the film, I didn't like it. I went in expecting horror and got what I thought was just a goofy, awful movie. But I went back and read the book and rewatched the film, and I think it actually gets the book dead on. The film is sort of a campy black comedy. Got the actors nail, Keanu Reeves especially, to a T. And I think that's what the book is too. Maybe not camp, because I guess camp hadn't been invented in 1897, but it's definitely a black comedy. And as far as I know, I've never talked to anyone or read anything about how funny this book is. So that's what I'm going to talk about today, is the humor in Dracula, in my opinion, that it's not so much a horror novel as it is a satire of Romantic era literature. Now, I said it's a Victorian era novel, but it was written in the style of a Gothic horror novel from the Romantic era. It's got this flowery language, a lot of purple prose and descriptions of nature, and a lot of creepy stuff like big castles, scary woods. And the Victorian era was more based on logic and reason, and it was reflected in a lot of the literature. But the Romantic era was more about emotion and superstition, and the novel has a lot of that in there. In my opinion, so much that it's funny. Also, it's an epistolary novel, which means there's not a narrator telling you what's happening. It's the entire book is a collection of letters, diary entries, journal entries, ship logs, newspaper clippings, and there's even like one of the characters talks into a phonograph, and it's like the transcription of his diary into the phonograph. Anyway, that was my first tip-off that maybe this was supposed to be funny, because reading this style, written 100 years after it was popular, just seemed off to me. And the prose and the lengths the characters would go to get things down in their diaries and in their letters, it just seemed weird. I got past it because it's like, it's an old book. People wrote differently back then. So I put it aside, kept reading it as a horror novel, and it was scary, it was exciting still, but still a little bit weird. And the second thing, the thing that really got me to thinking this was funny, were the characters. Now there's a handful of main characters. There's Jonathan Harker, who's the lawyer that goes to Transylvania to meet Dracula and finalize a real estate deal that he's made in London, that Dracula has made in London. He opens the novel with his journal entry, and the guy is like this milquetoast little twit, like an English milquetoast little twit, just like Keanu Reeves captures him so well in the movie. He's not a dumb guy, but he's really unworldly and naive. And it starts out with his journal entry in Transylvania before he actually meets Dracula. He spends a couple of nights in this little town before Dracula picks him up in his carriage and takes him to the castle. And the guy's so in over his head. Like, he gets a tummy ache from eating food with too much paprika in it. He is kind of shocked and frightened by how how voluptuous the women are and how scantily they dress and provocatively they dress. The men are big and burly, and they intimidate him. And so before he even gets to Dracula's castle, he is just like a total fish out of water. And when he does get there, bad things happen to him. Dracula holds him hostage, and this is all in his journal. Dracula holds him hostage. He almost gets his blood sucked by these three women who I guess are Dracula's assistants or girlfriends or something. And Dracula leaves him there for the women to kill, and goes to London to finalize the real estate deal that Jonathan Harker's helped him out with. Actually, turns out that Harker's kind of got a pair of balls. He does some pretty, ballsy things. It's almost like a stereotype of, the English there. On the surface, they might be kind of wimpy and limp-wristed, but deep down, they got a pair. And when they have to get something done, they do. And that's what this character's like. And to me, it was really, the first time I read it, could not put together how goofy he was with what he did. And the way he described things just was so effeminate. Like, he needed to get the recipe for a stew he had in a tavern in Transylvania. And just the way he described the girls attacking him in the castle was so funny. And the way he described Dracula crawling like a lizard out of his window down the side of his castle. I was like, the first time I read it, I didn't have it figured out yet. And I thought I just thought it was off. And I kept going, and Dracula goes back to London on a ship, kills everyone on the ship, and the ship washes into shore as a ghost ship with the captain strapped to the wheel. And this is where you meet the other characters in the novel, the other main characters aside from Dracula. The first is Harker's fiancée, Mina, and she's Mina. And she's probably the sanest, most level-headed person in the book, and I think has the most diary entries. And you pretty much follow the rest of the story between her and the other character, Sewell, who runs an insane asylum. But Mina's best friend is a girl named Lucy, this 19-year-old, just vapid bubblehead who's so beautiful that three men propose to her on the same day. She accepts one of the proposals to the rich son of a lord, the wealthiest one of the three, by the way, and they're set to be married. And she's Dracula's first victim in London, but I'll get back to her later. The next character is Sewell, who's the guy I mentioned earlier, Jonathan Sewell. He runs an insane asylum in London. And this guy's a freaking nut. He's almost as crazy as his patients. He's a morphine addict, and he takes a keen interest in one of his patients named Renfield, who turns out to be Dracula's assistant. Renfield's like this bug-eating freak. He puts food out for the flies in his windowsill in the asylum, catches the flies, starts eating them. Then he holds the flies and catches spiders, feeds the flies to the spiders so they get big and fat, starts eating them. Then when he gets a bunch of fat spiders, he gets birds to come into his room to feed on the spiders and get bigger and fat. Then he starts eating the birds. And the next thing he does is ask Sewell for a cat. Now Sewell knows exactly what he's going to do with this cat, but he decides maybe he should give him one anyway, in the interest of science. Luckily for the cat, a bunch of stuff happens and that doesn't work out. But even later, Renfield's acting really weird. Sewell tries to bribe him with a kitten so he'll tell him what's going on inside his head. And the whole thing is just over the top nuts. Although the first time, like I said, I didn't realize it. I just thought something was off. And another character, the two more main characters, there's Quincy and Arthur. Arthur's the one that agrees to, that's Lucy's fiancé, the beautiful Lucy's fiancé, who's a nobleman. And then there's Quincy, who's like this exaggerated stereotype of a Texan. He says y'all and all this and that. I'm from Texas, so it's a cool portrayal of a Texan, I guess. But man, it's just so over the top and crazy. So he's a comic character too. So as I'm reading this the first time, I'm like, what the hell is going on? All these characters are such goofs, you know, and so weird with the exception of Mina. And for me, and another thing, all this weird stuff happens, and they seem to make these irrational decisions, and this is after Dracula gets to town, and they seem to do just like the things that don't quite add up. And anyway, Dracula comes to town, and he starts to feed on the beautiful Lucy, who's a somnambulist, and you're not quite sure if he lures her out or if she's already out, and he, the first few times, comes up to her in the form of a bat and starts chewing on her neck, sucking her blood. She becomes anemic and sick and is bedridden. And they can't figure out what's wrong with her. Sewell, the doctor, author, can't figure out what's wrong with her. Mina can't figure out. Lucy's mom can't figure it out. So Sewell calls Van Helsing, who's a Dutch doctor, you know, the famous Van Helsing, who was Sewell's professor in medical school, and brings him in. And at this point, Lucy is bedridden, has these little pricks in her neck. They can't connect the two. She's anemic, she has holes in her neck. They still haven't figured it out, but Van Helsing does. And it takes him a little bit, but he figures out it's a vampire, and he puts garlic all over her room. They do blood transfusions with her. Just about everyone in the book gives her blood. Van Helsing, Quincy the Texan, author, her fiance, and Sewell all give her blood transfusions. But Dracula keeps, you know, luring her outside through her window and sucking her dry at night. And part of the problem is her mother. Her mother keeps coming in and like taking the garlic off her neck and opening her window so she can breathe better. Anyway, this happens over the course of a couple of weeks, and she loses so much blood she's almost dead. And by this time, Van Helsing has figured out what's wrong with her. And this all leads up to this crazy night where she's in bed with a garlic necklace on, garlic all over the room. The windows are shut, and her mother comes in bed to sleep with her that night because they're so worried. And as this is, before this happens, Dracula has gone into one of the local zoos and like somehow managed to get a wolf under his control. So that night, when Lucy and her mom are asleep, the wolf comes smashing through the window and wakes everybody up, scares her mother so bad, she has a heart condition, scares her so bad she falls over dead on top of Lucy, and as she's dying, whacks her in the head with her own head, knocks her stupid, pulls her garlic necklace off, and falls on top of her in the bed so she's pinned underneath her. And then a bat and a wolf come smashing through the window. The maids come running in, 4 maids come running in and see Lucy and her mom on the bed. They freak out and start panicking, and they're so worthless that Lucy yells at them to go into the parlor and each have a glass of wine. Well, the wine has been laced with laudanum. All 4 of them drink the wine and pass out on the floor simultaneously, and then, you know, Dracula sucks the rest of Lucy's blood and kills her. And as I'm reading this the first time, I was like, you know, you gotta be kidding me. All this goofy stuff has happened up to this point, and then this, you know, how am I supposed to keep reading this stuff and take this novel seriously? And then I put it down, thought about it a second, and it came to me that, you know, I'm not. There's no way this is an accident. All this crazy stuff that happens, all the goofy characters, all the wild purple prose and the epistolary style, and the lengths that they will go to write it, because the only way we can find out that this happened to Lucy, since there's no one, her mother's dead, the maids are passed out, is that she writes it herself. So with her mother's body on top of her in bed, after a wolf breaks through the window and a vampire bat's flapping around, she decides it's a good time to reach out and grab a hold of her quill and ink and start, you know, writing an 18-page diary entry about all this stuff that's happening. And I realized there's no way this is meant to be taken seriously. It's a joke. The book is satire. It has to be. It's a send-up of Romantic era literature. And once I got that idea in my head, I went back and reread the chapter about the wolf and breaking in and her mother falling dead on top of her. And it's like, yeah, this is funny. It's meant to be funny. And I read the rest of the novel with that in mind. And, you know, I don't mean, when I say it's a joke, I don't mean it's a joke of a book. It's a great book. It's a classic for a reason. It's exciting, it's scary, it's tense. And even if you read it as straight up horror, it's still a great novel. But if you go into the book with the idea that it's supposed to be funny, you'll get even more out of it. I know I did. And for the second half of the novel, this stuff with Lucy happens maybe at the halfway point. In the second half of the novel, I read it with the idea that it's supposed to be funny, and I enjoyed it even more than I did the first half of the book. And then when I went back and read it last week, read the whole thing again, it was way better, a lot more fun. And the second half of the novel, I guess everyone knows the story. They track, Jonathan Harker comes back from, he escapes, he's got a pair of balls deep down. He escapes, comes back to London. Van Helsing figures out who Dracula is and what he's up to. Harker goes and checks the shipping records for all the stuff that Dracula brought to London, because this is what Dracula's deal is. He brought 50 coffins up from Transylvania full of the soil of his castle and his homeland, because he has to sleep on that stuff at night. And so instead of just buying the one castle that Harker set up for him, he's got 50 different properties all over London with a coffin in each one, so he can go feed in different parts of the city and then come back at night and sleep on his soil that will replenish him and where he's safe. It's like 50 layers all over the city. Well, they figure out where they all are, and they go and start destroying them. And they encounter Dracula, and it's pretty funny the way it happens. They encounter Dracula a few times when it's happening. I guess the bad part is that Dracula gets hold of Mina, who's Harker's wife, starts sucking her blood in order to control her and to spy on these guys. But Van Helsing figures out a way to get around that. They can't catch Dracula, and they can't really help Mina because he keeps biting her. But they can communicate, and they can't tell her too much because if whatever she knows, Dracula also knows. But Van Helsing figures out a way to communicate with her at dusk and dawn, sort of the in-between time between when she's totally knocked out and incoherent and when she's under the spell of Dracula and he can see through her eyes. So he finds out what Dracula's up to, and they go after him. They destroy 49 of his 50 coffins, and then Dracula's like, fuck this, grabs his last coffin, gets on a boat, I think, and gets the hell out of there to go back home. So Van Helsing, author, Quincy, and Jonathan Harker all follow him back. I think he takes Mina with him. I can't remember. Anyway, they all follow him down, and he's almost back to his castle, and he's with this caravan of gypsies, and they attack the caravan, and there's this big, huge fight, and Harker, the English twit, shows a pair again and goes and slashes Dracula's throat, and doesn't quite kill him, but then Quincy the Texan stabs him in the heart with a Bowie knife and finishes him off. And Quincy, unfortunately, dies from his injuries. And then the book sort of ends abruptly after that. It goes from that to, in the future. When Dracula dies, Mina is saved, and she has a burn scar on her head from a cross, and that goes away and she's fine. And then it skips to the future where Harker and Mina have their first baby, who they name after all four. His name's like Quincy, Author, Van Helsing, Sewell, or something like that. They call him Quincy. And then that's the end. A little bit, kind of a weird ending, abrupt. I don't know, Stoker just said, I've had enough of this shit. I need to get on to something else. Let's end it. Anyway, kind of a cool ending, kind of abrupt, whatever. And after I read it the first time, I was like, I looked around on the internet and talked to people to see if anyone else saw this as funny, and no one did. And which I think is a mistake. I think if you read this with an open mind and try to enjoy the humor in it and not ignore it, I think you'll get even more out of the novel. So hopefully either go back and reread it or read it for the first time with that in mind, and you'll really get more out of it, I think. And if you don't have time to read the book, at the very least, go see the Keanu Reeves film with Anthony Hopkins. And go into it with the mindset that it's a black comedy and it's meant to be funny, and you'll really get a lot out of the film too. So this is run on a little longer than I thought, but So I'll go ahead and end it next week. I'm not sure what I'm going to do next week. I'll surprise you. I don't know who all's watching this, but if you are, leave me a comment, hit the like button, whatever the hell you do on YouTube, and I'll try to respond to you. So once again, Chris Gordon with Beneath the Ficus. Hope you enjoyed it.